Hi everybody, welcome to our fifth lecture now? Fifth lecture in the Christ and Culture series. And we've already looked at quite a few of the typologies. Today we're going to look at the second of our median typologies, which is the Christ and culture in paradox. And that's a very, very interesting typology for us to look at. Christ and culture in paradox is the second of the median types. Remember the first two typologies that we looked at the first one, which was Christ against culture. Those are the people that withdraw themselves entirely from the culture. The Quakers, the Amish, the Mennonites, those kind of people who see that culture as so corrupt and so utterly bad that they don't want nothing to do with the culture at all. And so they withdraw from the culture. They usually form their own little communities. It can also be like the monastic orders, the people who escape into the desert or into their little cloistered shells all by themselves apart from the culture at large. So that's a Christ against culture type people. On one extreme, these are the extreme positions. And then on the other extreme of the spectrum, we looked at our second typology, which was the Christ of culture types. Those are the Christians, and they are Christians, who are so comfortable with the culture at large. They see nothing wrong with the world. Nothing is bad. They enjoy life. They enjoy all of the amenities and the luxuries and the good things that come with cultural living. And so for them, it's Christ of culture. So those are the two kind of extremes within the Christian family. One where there's no contact with culture, and the other where everything is cultural and everything is okay and everything harmonizes well with their Christianity. So those are the extremes. And then in between those extremes, in the middle, kind of the center position of all of this, are the three median types. And we saw the first of the median types last week, which was the Catholic model, which is a Christ above culture. If you remember from last week, most of Roman Catholicism is built on hierarchies, right? Everything is hierarchical. God at the top, Jesus Christ, the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit at the top, and everything flows from there. And so they order everything in hierarchies in the Roman Catholic Church. So it's Christ above culture, and they're kind of synthetists. They enjoy living in the world. They know that they can't escape the world. They're a little bit different from the Christ of culture types because they recognize that culture has been somewhat corrupted and so forth. But like Thomas Aquinas, who was the prime exemplar of this synthetist Christ above culture type person, there's still culture is redeemable. So you can participate in it. You can use philosophy and logic and enjoy the culture and help contribute to the culture and make things happen. So those were the three that we saw, and today we're going to look at Christ above culture, which is the Lutheran type, the Lutheran model, and that's why I brought my little Martin Luther bobblehead doll. This guy is fantastic. It was given to me by Yancey, and if you notice, he has a hammer and a nail in his hand, because what is he famous for? For hammering the 95 Thesis up on the cathedral door at the Cathedral of Wittenberg in Germany about his 95 protests of what was going on in the Roman Catholic Church at the time. This is the 16th century, and of course, he was himself part of the Catholic Church. His intention was not to break from the Catholic Church at all. He was an Augustinian monk, and he was a scholar. He taught in Catholic universities. Well, it wasn't a Catholic university, it was the University of Wittenberg, which was a public university at the time, but he belonged to the Catholic Church, and so his intention was not to break, but to reform the Catholic Church from within, because there was so much corruption that was going on. And so that's what he was trying to do, but of course, ultimately it didn't work, so he had to secede. And then the Protestant Reformation, actually, so he's one of the founders, one of the major figures for the Protestant Reformation. And most of us in this room, I guess, the majority of us, if we're Christians, are Protestants. So we owe a huge debt of gratitude to this bobblehead guy over here. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude because every Sunday when I'm like struggling with materials and what to do, and sometimes I get frustrated, well, he's right over there. I can slap him on the head, and then I feel a little bit better, and then get back to work. So he's my favorite buddy right next to my workstation and the computer. Anyway, so this is the problem with the Christ above culture thing, where they institutionalize everything in the world. The problem with institutionalizing things is that gradually, over a period of time, what tends to happen to institutions? Corruption. Corruption always sets in inevitably. In every single thing that becomes institutionalized, corruption sets in. And so Thomas Aquinas and Christ above culture and the Roman Catholic thing, which began in the 12th century, by the 16th century, which is the time of Martin Luther, the Catholic Church had become utterly corrupt. And we're not just talking about the secular world, we're talking about the church itself. And so that was the environment that Martin Luther was in. And so for him, he attempted to reform the Catholic Church from within, because he was within the church. But they kicked him out, you know. Now, he was not the only person to try to reform the church. There were many prior to him. We can even think of people like Wycliffe, you know, for whom we have the Wycliffe Bible translators in England, what he tried to do, because the Bible was in Latin and nobody could read it. And so he tried to Wycliffe tried to translate the Bible into English for the common folk so that they could read it. But that was heresy to the church, you know. And what did they do with Wycliffe? They burned him at the stake. Because that's what you do with heretics. When you are Christendom, when you have all the power, the political power, when you're married with the political power, religious power, it's all there. You can do that to supposed heretics, right? They burned him at the stake. And then I heard that 100 years later, they weren't quite so satisfied with that. They dug him up again, all his bones, and burned him again, you know? So the church gradually, once it becomes institutionalized, becomes corrupted. And there needs to be these cycles of reformation that go on in the church in order to clear it, to purge it of all of that kind of stuff and make the church a better place. And that's what Martin Luther was attempting to do. Ultimately, it failed, so he had to secede from that. Now, the good thing, the lucky thing for Martin Luther is that he was protected. Wycliffe was not. There were other people who, you know, they didn't have any political power. So it was easy for the church to come and just destroy them and vanquish them. But there was a prince of Saxony who was a good friend and protector of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther could holler and protest and say all kinds of things because this prince in Saxony was protecting him. And so the Catholic Church couldn't touch him. So in many ways, because of that, he was able to institute this kind of reformation. And the Protestant movement began at that time. Now, Martin Luther is really the exemplar of the Christ and culture and paradox typology. So we'll take a look at this one, okay? And to do that, let's just go ahead and jump right into it from the book itself. We'll start with the beginning of the chapter on Christ and culture and paradox. And Niebuhr right away calls it the theology of the duelists. So these people, Christ and culture and paradox, means they're two opposing things, right? That are seemingly contradictory, but they exist at the same time, and you can't reconcile both of them. That's what a paradox is. They're both over there, and so you don't have the means of reconciling them or harmonizing them together. You just have to live in the tension between those two things which are both apparently true at the same time, and yet they can't be reconciled. So that's why Niebuhr refers to them as the duelists. Now be very careful. We're not talking about the sort of dualism that the Gnostics had. Do you remember the Gnostics? Gnostic dualism was what? The material and the non-material. The physical and the metaphysical. So that was Gnostic dualism. That's not what we're talking about over here. Here we're talking about, how do I explain this sort of a dualism? It's, we'll look at examples as we go along. Maybe that's a better way to do it, because it's very, very difficult to explain the dualism of Martin Luther. We'll have to take a look at the examples as they come along, okay? So here we go. Niebuhr starts by saying, efforts to synthesize Christ and culture That was the Christ above culture. That was Thomas Aquinas, the example we saw from last week. They were the synthesizers, right? So these efforts to synthesize Christ and culture, well, those efforts have been subject to sharp attacks throughout Christian history. Radicals. These are the Christ against culture types. The radicals have protested that these attempts are disguised versions of cultural accommodation of the rigorous gospel, and that they broaden the narrow way of life into an easy highway. You're making things too easy. That's what the radicals are saying to the Catholic Church. You know, the Quakers, the Mennonites, those kinds of people. You're making the Christian life too easy. So that was their protest. Whereas the cultural Christians, the Christ of culture types, have objected that the synthetists retain as evangelical truth vestigial remnants of old immature ways of thought. So the synthetists are the people who are modern, you know, do away with the old stuff. They want the modern things. And so that's the kind of polar opposites criticizing the middle, the synthetists, the Christians in the middle, the Catholic Church, the Church of the Center. However, those polar opposites are not the strongest opposition. They're not the strongest critics of the Roman Catholic Church. Niebuhr goes on to say, the strongest opposition, however, has been voiced by neither the extremes left or right-wing parties, not by the extremes, although they do protest the Catholic Church, but the strongest opposition is by another central group. It's another Christ at the center group. And that is to say, by one which also seeks to answer the Christ and culture question with a both and. So they're centrist also. The duelists. Martin Luther is a centrist. The Roman Catholic Church is centrist. Martin Luther is centrist. The extremes are the Christ against culture and the Christ of culture types. So Christ against culture are the radicals. Christ of culture type are the accommodators. Christ above culture are the synthesizers. And then the Christ in culture and paradox are the duelists. And the duelists and the synthesizers are the church of the center. They're not in the extremes, they're in the center. They occupy a center position. But they strongly critique each other more than the extremes do. You get it? So who did Martin Luther critique? The Catholic Church, the church at the center. He wasn't so much concerned about the extremes, he was concerned about the corruption of the church in the center. And so this is the group which, for want of a better name, he can't figure out a better name to give them. He calls them then the duelists. Dualism. And that's why we need to be very, very careful with this term dualism, because it's a different kind of dualism from the Gnostic dualism that we looked at earlier. It's a different kind of dualism, and it's very difficult to describe. He doesn't even have a better name for it over here. So we'll look at some of the examples as we go ahead. So he goes on, Niebuhr goes on to say this: the dualist, the Martin Luther types, how do they live? They live in conflict. That's why it's these paradox. And the paradox cannot be resolved. Life is tense. Life is full of conflict. And you're not going to be able to resolve it. Therefore, your only solution is to do what? To live in it. There's nothing else that you can do. If you try to fix it, you're just going to go crazy and end up in some lunatic asylum, because it's unfixable. The gap between the two is unbridgeable. And so you just need to live life holding both things. It's like walking on a tightrope, holding this thing, right? And balancing yourself on the edge of this thing. That's what the dualist does. He lives within the conflict of these polar opposites. And in the presence of one great issue, there's one great thing that causes all of this conflict. What is that? God and man. The conflict is between God and man. The conflict is not Christ and culture. It's not a horizontal conflict per se. the major issue, the major conflict is this one: God and man. Man has rebelled against God. God and man. Man is in rebellion against God. And that's what causes all the tension and all of the problems and issues in the world. So, or better, since the dualist is an existential thinker. We're beginning to see the rise of existential philosophy in the 16th century. These are the seeds of that. It's a deep, thoughtful philosophy which sees the world as an entirely complicated place. It's intensely difficult to live in the world, isn't it? There's a lot of tension, struggles and fights going on. And the simplistic answers of the extremes don't do you any good. The Christ against culture and the Christ of culture, those answers are black and white. They're simplistic, and therefore they don't describe the nitty-gritty reality of living in a world of struggle and tension and hardship and pain and disappointment and joy and happiness in the midst of it. This dualistic thing, you see? Joy and pain, and it'll never be resolved. But that's the life that we live. And so we just have to grit our teeth and live in it. That's what this Christ and culture and paradox kind of looks like. So what is this conflict? It's between God and us. And by that, notice us is the plural. He's not talking about the individual person. He's talking about humanity. Humanity, all of it entirely has rebelled against God, and that's the source of the conflict. And because of that conflict, everything in the world is now filled with tension and struggle and hardship. And so the real issue lies between this thing: the righteousness of God and the righteousness of self. I'm self-righteous. It's the struggle for human independence, wanting to live a life apart from God, to derive my own righteousness from my own self. No, thank you, God. I don't need you. I want to live my own life. And so, because of that rebelliousness, there's this tension in the world. And so, he goes on to say this: no matter what the dualist psychological history may have been, his logical starting point in dealing with the cultural problem, what's the starting point? The great act of reconciliation and forgiveness. This is key. The starting point is the fact that in spite of this tension, in spite of this rebelliousness, God has provided an act of reconciliation and an act of forgiveness. And that has occurred in the midst of the divine human battle. This great act of reconciliation that's been provided is in spite of the fact that humans are battling God, that they've rebelled against God. And what is this act? It's the act that we call Jesus Christ. So what does God do? When man is in constant rebellion against God, He sends His Son, Jesus Christ. And that's the act of reconciliation and forgiveness. In Christ, we find reconciliation and forgiveness. And so, from this beginning, the fact that there was and is a conflict, the fact of God's grace, here's the dualism: God's grace and human sin. You see those two things? God's grace and human sin. That's what we have. This paradox. These both are true. And we have to live within the tension of those two things. God's grace, the act of reconciliation and forgiveness given to us. And yet, humankind is sinful, rebellious, and corrupt. And we live within that tension. You see the dualism now? Grace, sin. So the dualist lives within this conflict. But the starting point is grace. God's grace. Grace is found in God, but sin is found in man. Grace in God, sin in man. And so there's this historic war that's gone on from the very first human beings, a war of man against God. And the only thing that can bridge that, there's no human effort that can bridge that tension, is the grace of God. That's the only thing that can break it. It's not by human effort. You can't do it. And so in this view, in this Christ and culture in paradox view, human works are not only pitifully inadequate, measured by the standard of God's goodness, but they are actually sordid and depraved. There's nothing you can do to bridge that gap. All you can do then, as a sinful, fallen, corrupted being, is live in that tension of God's grace and human sin. So the synthesist, however, the Thomas Aquinas type, do you remember last week when we talked about the Roman Catholic model? For the Roman Catholic model, it was works. You worked your way towards salvation. You did good things, and then God would add His grace on top of that. But you needed to work. So this is a radically, radically different position from the church at the center position of the Roman Catholic Church. Even though Augustine was part of the Roman Catholic Church, he came to the point of realizing that human works are depraved. They're utterly sinful and corrupt. And there's nothing that I can do to bridge the gap, the distance that exists between God and man. Nothing will do that for me. And so what did Martin Luther become? He became the guy famous for the doctrine of justification by faith through grace, not by works. And where does he derive that doctrine from? He derives it from the Bible. And most importantly from the Apostle Paul, the book of Romans and the book of Galatians, where there's this thing about justification. How are human beings justified before a holy and righteous God? By a free gift, by grace, because God reached down in the person of Jesus Christ. It's God's grace. Human sin, God's grace. That's what we're talking about in the Martin Luther model. This dualism. Okay? Human culture is utterly corrupt. Unlike Thomas Aquinas. Remember Thomas Aquinas, Christ above culture? Culture is okay. There are things we can get, philosophy and education and politics and commerce and things is great. Let's participate in it. We can do good things out of it. Not for Luther. Human culture is utterly corrupt, and in this way he actually sides with those Christ against culture types, the radicals on the extreme left. So Luther is a little bit more leftist leaning than the church at the center, the Roman Catholic Church, which leans more towards the right side, towards the Christ of culture people. So that's the great difference between those two. For Aquinas, culture is good. It's a beautiful thing. We can do great stuff with it. For Luther, it's corrupt. It's utterly sinful, corrupt. Nothing redeemable about the culture at large. Music, it's just for self-glorification. Right? So human culture is corrupt, and it includes all human work. All of it. All of it is corrupt. Well, you can enjoy your movies, you can enjoy your music, which I do, but just be aware that it is sinful and bad and corrupt. And so not simply the achievements of men outside the church, but also those in it. The corruption is not just in the secular world, but it's been inflicted within the church itself. Because what happened to the institutionalized Roman Catholic Church by Martin Luther's time? Utterly sinful, corrupt. That's what the church looked like. And so not only philosophy, so far as it is human achievement, but theology also is corrupt. So Aquinas loved philosophy. He had rediscovered Aristotle and brought Aristotle back into the Western world, right? Philosophy was great stuff, but for Martin Luther, philosophy itself is corrupt, but not just the philosophy, but even theology is corrupt. There are always these dualisms. Not only Jewish defense of Jewish law, but also Christian defense of Christian precept. The entire shebang is utterly, utterly sinful and corrupt. You know, one of the things that we talk about in the Great Reformation is that thing about the Tulip? The Tulip, which is kind of like a little short acronym for what the Reformation ideas are. And the first one, the T, Tulip, stands for total depravity. That's what the world is. It's totally depraved. It's utterly corrupt. There's nothing redeemable out of it. Now, that's the kind of a doctrine that comes out of the Reformation period with this Augustinian monk in the Roman Catholic Church, who is a monk in the church, and he sees the utter depravity of the church itself. Even the church itself is sinful and corrupted now. There's nothing good left. And so the only thing that can bridge the gap is God's grace. Because there ain't nothing that I can do. Even my own works, even my efforts at being good are totally corrupt. What does total corruption mean for Martin Luther? You have to be very careful. Let me make a subtle distinction, because when people hear the term total depravity, they think, it means that there's nothing good. That's not what Martin Luther actually meant. He meant that even when we do good things, those good things are corrupted. So think of it this way. Imagine a little hypothetical scenario of a 10-year-old Boy Scout. So he's out there in the world trying to do something good, because that's part of his Boy Scout motto. And he sees this old lady trying to cross the street, and he goes, let me go do my good deed. So he runs over to the old lady and says, hey, let me help you across the street. It's a busy street and there are cars everywhere. And so he walks it and, importantly, stops all the cars and gets the lady safely across the street. And the lady goes, oh, thank you so much. Gives him a little kiss. And so he starts walking back home, puffed up with pride. So what happened to his good works? See, even when you do good things, there's a corruption in it. That's what total depravity means. It doesn't mean that you will never do any good thing. It means that even when you try to do good works, even those good works will have a measure of taintedness and corruption in them. That's what total depravity actually means. So keep in mind that when Martin Luther is giving this negative verdict about the culture at large, keep in mind this thing. He's not passing judgment on you and you and you, on individual human beings. That's not what he's doing. Rather, he's passing judgment on himself and then the whole of humanity. He's not excluding himself from this. He is included. I am totally corrupt. I try. And this was Martin Luther as an Augustinian monk. He really, really tried to live a good life. You know, and the stories of him beating himself with a whip to get rid of his passions and the kind of things that monks do to try to live that good life. And it didn't work. Because all of that stuff was totally corrupt, you see. So he's talking out of his own personal experience and applying it not to individual people, but to the whole of humanity. This corruption. And so when he speaks of the corruption of reason, when he says Thomas Aquinas, philosophy, utterly corrupt, it's bankrupt, well, Martin Luther speaks about the corruption of reason as a reasoner himself, as somebody who is deeply engaged, involved in the corruption, in a corrupt system, but yet he has to use that corrupt system to talk about it, because there's no other way. So he does so as a reasoner who has tried ardently to ascend to the knowledge of truth. So even though he's criticizing himself because he is in the same position as the thing being criticized. That's Martin Luther. And so all human culture is infected by godlessness, which is the will to live without God. And that is really the essence of sin. Remember back in Genesis when Adam and Eve, they rebelled against God because God told them something. Don't eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because that tree represents this idea that I don't need God. I can gain my own wisdom, my own knowledge, my own idea of what's right and wrong, independent of God. And that's what human sin looks like. And so the dualist situation is one of standing in the middle of this sinful rebellion. He's not outside of it. I am stuck right in the middle of this paradox, and I can't resolve it. I'm right here. So I can only speak about this situation in paradoxes. From the side of man in an encounter with a holy God. From sinful man to a holy God. In the midst of that tension, that's where I reside. That's where I live. And that's the nitty-gritty reality of life in this world. Martin Luther, that's him. Let's look a little bit at him. Martin Luther was born in 1483 and died in 1546. So we're talking about 16th century, around the 16th century. He was a German monk who is, the father of the Protestant Reformation. Come on, so all of us have been directly influenced by this man. What was he? He was a doctor of theology. He was a very learned man, extremely bright, intellectual, and he was part of the faculty of the University of Wittenberg. In 31st of October, 1517, he nailed the 95 Thesis on the cathedral door, the Cathedral of Wittenberg, his protest about the corruption, the utter sinful corruption of the Roman Catholic Church, of which he was a part of. You see, he stood right in the middle of that corruption. He could only speak of the corruption from within it. He can't speak of it as if he's some detached, objective observer outside of human existence. There is no such thing. I live in the midst of this tension. So when I criticize it, I'm criticizing it as one who is within the problem. And so his great breakthrough, of course, was this idea of justification by faith alone. Sola fide, gratia sola, sola scriptura. These ideas of only this, only this, only this. I'm not saved by a combination of my good works that God then adds His grace on top of. No, Roman Catholic Church, you're utterly wrong about that. My works can't do, even my good works, my efforts at doing good things are utterly corrupted, you see. So the only thing that can justify me, only thing is God's grace. There's nothing else. I can't add to it. Only God's grace. I can only cry out in despair in my condition within this problem. Cry out in despair. That's it. And it's God's grace, faith alone, grace alone, and then sola scriptura, Scripture alone. So these great solas was what Martin Luther was talking about. To Roman Catholic Church that had become institutionalized, and it, in that process had become utterly corrupt by the 16th century. Now, of course, he had a protector, thank goodness. Otherwise, the Protestant Reformation would have been nipped at the bud, like it had happened to people prior to him. Every time that somebody tried to protest against the institutionalized church, they were just killed off. Talking about what? Joan of Arc, remember her? Burned at the stake. That's what Christendom, a church that is empowered with political structure, does, and becomes utterly corrupt. But fortunately, he had a protector in Prince Frederick III of Saxony. So the Roman Catholic Church couldn't touch him. And he was able to be courageous and strong and protest against the church and rail against the church because he was protected. So ultimately, they had these huge debates within the Catholic Church, and he was rejected by them completely. So ultimately, he had to organize a separate Protestant church, which became the German Church, which is the state church of Germany to this day. The Lutheran Church is the state church of Germany. And so that's what he did. And this guy was so incredibly smart, so intellectual. He did incredible stuff. He translated the entire Bible into the German language. So one of the earliest, there's a Gutenberg press at the time also. So they were able to start mass producing Bibles in the common vernacular of people so that the people could finally begin to read this text. And it wasn't just, sola scriptura. It wasn't just the church telling you what the Bible says. But you could read it for your own. That's the great sola scriptura. Church tradition, forget about that. We need the scriptures. So he translated, he wrote a great many hymns. A mighty fortress is our God. All of those kind of wonderful hymns, which I'm told most of them were like bar songs where people would go and sing in the bars and drink beer. And so he would just take those tunes and just put Christian lyrics to them. A mighty fortress is our... And you can imagine people in the bar singing some secular pagan song like that, getting drunk, right? And he just takes those nice little ditties and tunes and, I'm going to put some Christian lyrics to them, and that's what we did, sing in church. So Martin Luther was incredibly smart. Brilliant man. The story about him was, of course, he wasn't intending to become a monk. This was not his intention. He didn't want to do any of this kind of stuff. Rather, he wanted to become a lawyer, because lawyers make good money. And so when he was younger and he was smart, and so his parents sent him to university. And he says that at the university, it was just like a big party. Everybody was getting drunk and doing all kinds of immoral stuff, which is what happens in universities all over the place, all these frat parties, and y'all been there, you know what it is. So here's Martin Luther, he goes into university and it's like, whoa, this is a big party, yeah, have a good time. A brilliant man working on his law degree, and then one day he's riding on his horse. July 2nd, 1505, as a young law student, riding on his horse. He was returning to university on horseback after he had taken a trip back home, and suddenly this huge thunderstorm came up. It was like what happens here in Florida, in Tampa, right, in the summertime. And a lightning bolt came and hit right next to the horse. Poof! And he got scared out of his life. The living Dickens was out of his life. It was like, whoa! And so he cried out to God and said, help, help! I'll become a monk if you don't kill me. And then he returned home safely, survived the thunderstorm which he thought would kill him. And he took his vows seriously that day and said, okay, no more law degree. It's time for me to go this way. And that's how he became a monk. So he sold all of his books and he entered St. Augustine's Monastery in Erfurt on the 17th of July, 1505. And that's kind of the story of how he became a monk. And brilliant student, so he fell in love with theology. But even prior to that, he was already very well versed in things like Greek and Hebrew, because he was just a very brilliant man. So that's why he's able to translate the Bible into German, into the common vernacular, because he's so well versed in these ancient languages.
How long did that take?
I don't know. I struggle with my Greek to this day, and I love reading Greek, but it's difficult because there's nobody to talk to. It's a dead language. Even modern Greek nowadays is very different from the kind of Greek that existed in the first century. So I love it, but it's incredibly difficult to do. And it's, well, we're not going to overcomplicate things by talking about that, okay? So all we're saying is Martin Luther was incredibly smart. And so he earned his doctor in theology and became a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. And that's where he began to teach the students there, the theology students from the book of Romans particularly, and the book of Galatians, which I brought with me today. My commentary on Galatians from Martin Luther. I actually have my commentary on Romans from Martin Luther also, but I can't find it anywhere. I think somebody borrowed it from me and I never got it back because I was looking all over the place for it. But yeah, so just a prolific writer. He wrote a whole, I got this entire volume set of Martin Luther works. So just a very, very brilliant, productive type of a person. Very, very rare breed indeed, right? So, this is his commentary in Galatians, which maybe I should read a little section to you. I have a little highlighted section. This is the introduction to the commentary in Galatians, and he says this. First of all, we speak of the argument of this epistle, Galatians. It's an epistle, which is a Greek word for letter, right? We speak about the argument. What's the argument? Well, in it, Paul is seeking to establish the doctrine of faith, grace, forgiveness of sins, or Christian righteousness, in order that we may know the difference between Christian righteousness and all other kinds of righteousness. Dualism. Everything is kind of these dualistic poles in Lutheran thought. And it's what? Grace, faith, righteousness. Is this really what Paul does in the letter to the Galatians? Interestingly, that's pretty debatable. But we won't go there for now, okay? And so he goes on to say this. Above all these, there is yet another righteousness. The righteousness of faith. Christian righteousness. It's the only one. Above every other form of righteousness, faith, which we must diligently discern from others. The others are quite contrary to this righteousness. So we must diligently make a division between Christian righteousness, which comes by faith alone, and every other form of righteousness. Both because they flow out of the laws of kings and rulers, religious traditions and the commandments of God, and because they consist in our works, and may be wrought by us either by our natural strength or else by the gift of God. These kinds of righteousness are also the gift of God, yeah. These human efforts at being good and works righteousness, they are also a gift of God like all other good things which we enjoy. But the most excellent righteousness of faith, which God through Christ, without any works, imputes to us, is neither political, nor ceremonial, nor the righteousness of God's law. You don't get it by trying to keep God's law, nor consists of works, but is contrary to these things. That is to say, it is a mere passive righteousness. I don't actively get it. I passively receive it from God, as the others are active. The troubled conscience, in view of God's judgment, has no remedy. There's no solution to our existential angst, living in paradox in this situation that we are in. Has no remedy against desperation and eternal death, unless it takes hold of the forgiveness of sins by grace, freely offered in Christ Jesus, which if it can apprehend, it may then be at rest. Absolutely, totally, radically different from the Roman Catholic Church's doctrine of salvation. To this day, Roman Catholics will tell you, you got to work, you got to do good works, and only if you're trying to do those good works You might not do them perfectly, but you try them. Will God then add His grace on top of it? And so Roman Catholic salvation is this combination of your works and God's grace, not Luther. My works are utterly, sinfully corrupt. There's nothing good that I can do. Absolutely nothing. So the only thing I can do is cry out in desperation to God, who then reaches out with His grace, His free gift, and saves me, undeserving, wretched human being that I am, living in this crazy, corrupted tension of a world where I cannot resolve it. It's beyond my capacity to resolve. So Martin Luther was a man of struggle. That's the key word. It's a struggle to live in this world. And is that your own living reality? Is that what you perceive about life here? Well, Martin Luther might just be your voice then. If you solely rely on God's grace, knowing how utterly wretched and corrupt you are, I am, then you just might be a Lutheran, a Christ and culture in paradox. I can't resolve it myself. Therefore, I can only live in it. That type of thing. The dualist, he seems to have a double attitude toward reason and philosophy. Now look at all these dualisms, okay? They're all double attitudes. Business and trade, religious organizations and rights, state and politics, all these unresolvable tensions and dualism that exist out there in the world, which I'll never be able to resolve. All I can do is live in the struggle of it. And so these antinomies, that's a big word. It's a Greek word again. So anti is against, and nomos, law. So this lawlessness, this against the law kind of thing, antinomies and paradoxes have often led to the suggestion that Luther divided life into compartments. He's like one of those crazy people, me, myself, and Irene. Compartmentalized life. Don't we all do that? My life as the husband, my life as the worker, my life as the father. We compartmentalize our lives into these different segments. Luther divided life into compartments, so taught that the Christian right hand should not know what the man's worldly left hand was doing. Totally polar, opposite, different things, and yet that's what I have to do. I can't resolve it, that's what I have to do. So his utterances sometimes seem to support this view. He makes sharp distinctions between the temporal and the spiritual. Again, dualisms. But between what is external and internal, dualisms again. Between body and soul. See? Dualisms between the reign of Christ and the world of human works of culture. Everything is in paradox to each other, but so be it. I can't resolve it. This is where I live. So duality is in the juxtaposition of opposites which are seemingly incompatible. Yet this is human existence. This is how we live. Fallen and yet saved. And so, like the radical, the Christ against culture types, the extreme ones, they take sin and corruption very, very seriously. As opposed to the Christ of culture types who hardly have any doctrine of sin. Oh, the world is great. Everything is agreeable. So they don't really think about sin and corruption at all on that side. But Martin Luther tends to side with these people, the Christ against culture types. They take it seriously. But unlike the Christ against culture radicals, this is the thing. Martin Luther knows I can't escape the world. I can't withdraw from it. I can't be like those monks out in the desert or those Quakers or Mennonites trying to escape the world. I can't. I'm stuck in the middle of it. There's no escape. Therefore, the only thing I can do is live in the tension of real nitty-gritty reality of life. So that's what differentiates him from the Christ against culture types. Although they both agree about the seriousness of sin and corruption. One tries to escape the world, and this one, Martin Luther said, I can't. I'm just going to go to the pub and drink a beer then, and be part and participate in this utterly sinful world. That's why one of his most misunderstood sayings is, if you're going to sin, sin strongly. Pecca fortiter, he said. Because there's nothing else I can do except live in this sinful, corrupted world and rely on the grace of God. That's it. So Luther affirmed in this strange, paradoxical way, he affirmed the cultural life. Be part of the culture. Knowing all the while how sinful and corrupted it is. Go to university. Get your degree. Get a job. Become a politician. Join the army. Become a carpenter. Make music. Be an actor. Drink a beer. It's German, of course. You know, they drink beer for breakfast, don't they? Yeah. So he affirmed the cultural life. All the while knowing. That's why I enjoy my music as a Christian. Right? Like every one of these positions we've been looking at, and this is the fourth one, there are always strengths and weaknesses to each position. We saw the Christ against culture, Christ of culture, Christ and culture, Christ above culture, and Christ and culture in paradox today. Every one of these has strengths, and every one of them has glaring weaknesses. So too does Martin Luther's position. So some of the strengths, well, the strength of this position is that it actually mirrors the struggles that you and me go through in life, doesn't it? And that it's this unresolvable tension that we live in. Christians living in the world, we ain't ever going to be able to solve it. What can we do except just live in it? So it does mirror who we are. It speaks to us. Because there's this recognition of the sinful human condition and of God's grace. Great strength in this position, at least for Protestants like you and me, is that we are indeed saved by grace through faith, and that there's no work of our own. Our works are totally depraved, total depravity. Even our good works, sin has a way of sneaking in through the back door. Oh, I just helped the lady across the street. Now I'm puffed up with pride. Look at me, I'm a good person. A little Boy Scout, right? Pride goes before what? Proverbs. Man, I'm having terrible difficulty with my Proverbs this morning. But yeah, pride is considered a cardinal sin because it leads to a whole bunch of really, really bad places. Right? So there's nothing that we can do, no work whatsoever, except God's grace. And that's it. Sola fide. Gratia sola. And the other strength is that it actually reinvigorates both Christianity and culture. So the Roman institutionalized church is utterly sinful and corrupted by the 16th century. Martin Luther cries out and protests against it, although they don't accept him, and so he has to separate out and start Protestant churches in Germany, which spread all over Europe in his lifetime, by the way. Yet, you know what the Roman Catholic Church did after that? we might have to do a Reformation ourselves. And so following the Protestant Reformation, there was a Catholic Reformation. And some of the things that Martin Luther protested against in his 95 Theses, they took care of. The indulgences, the sale of indulgences particularly, which was horrible. It was rampant throughout Western Europe at the time. You know what was going on? This is what happened. Martin Luther was a professor at the University of Wittenberg, and this guy, a Benedictine priest, comes into his town. I forgot his name. His name is not that important. But he comes into his town and starts selling indulgences. You know what indulgences are? Indulgences are, you buy this thing, it'll shorten your time in purgatory so you get to heaven quicker. That's what an indulgence is. And he was authorized by the Pope back in Rome to go ahead and sell these things in the town in Wittenberg. And the reason why is because the Cathedral of St. Peter, the Basilica, the beautiful place over there needed, it was falling apart, so they needed some funds to build it up again. So the Pope sent these people out there to make some money. So this guy comes into Wittenberg selling these indulgences, and I think his quote was like, "Buy this and shorten your time." Sounds like a great advertisement, doesn't it? That's what he was doing. And Luther, as a professor at the university and an Augustinian monk himself, in charge of the Catholic Church in his area, sees this and goes, "Hey, what are you doing? That ain't right." "Oh, I got the backing of the Pope. They're telling me to do this stuff. Get out of my way, boy." So Martin Luther starts writing letters to his archbishop and people in power, and they all completely ignore him. Because this comes from the Pope. They want to build their St. Peter's Basilica, which you can go to in Rome and look at and go, "Wow, hey, that's beautiful." Right? And so that's where they are. And so what does Luther do finally? Fed up that nobody in the church hierarchy is all corrupted, is listening to his protest. 95 Theses, bang, 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 on the door at the Cathedral of Wittenberg. Now, that act in and of itself would have not made a single bit of difference, except for the fact that there were a lot of other people that saw that, translated it into their own languages, into English, into Polish, into French and stuff, and took it with them. And that movement, for some reason, all of a sudden just grew huge. Well, I can see a divine hand in it, of course, but that's what happened. And then before you knew it, there was this big, huge revolutionary fire of protest going on. And this poor Augustinian monk in a small city in Wittenberg who didn't know nothing, what's going on? Oh no, they might chop my head off now. And he was living in a great deal of worry and angst at the time, when then the protector, the Lord Protector of the region, decided to take him under his wings and protect him. That's what was happening with him. So, what does it do? This protest, every once in a while, the institutional church needs a big shake-up. That's what a Reformation basically is. Because you see it. It happens. Nowadays, things happen so quickly. We don't need 100 years, 200 years for the church to become corrupt. It happens in a generation nowadays. That's why there's always this church planting movement in America. Because the old churches are just corrupt. We see that all the time. That generation has just become lazy and don't want to do nothing right? And so the next generation comes up, and I'm not going to be a part of that church. I'm just going to go out and start my own protest church. That's what the Protestant church is. And it's a successive protest. Every generation has to do that. In fact, one of the things that Luther insightfully talked about when he talked about the church is that it has to be a church that is constantly reforming itself. The ecclesia semper reformanda. Every generation needs to reform. Otherwise, the institutional church will fall prey to the corruption of the world. And so it reinvigorates not just the culture, not just Christianity, but also the culture at large. So those are some of the strengths, and they're great strengths, right? But then there's also some weaknesses to it, and the two main glaring weaknesses you can talk about. First of all is that this sort of dualistic tendency tends to lead Christians into antinomianism. We looked at that word before, anti, against, nomos, law. So it leads to antinomianism, meaning I don't need to follow the law. Oh, I'm saved by grace, therefore I can do whatever the heck I want to do. I'm going to go cheat on my wife, drink a beer and enjoy life. All the while knowing in my head that it's all corrupt and sinful, but I'm going to participate in the corruption and the sin anyway. Antinomian attitude. So the doctrine of salvation by grace is often heavily criticized by Catholics who have a different view of salvation. Because there are many, many nominal Christians, people who think, oh, I'm saved by grace. Let me go cheat in business, lie to people, do all kinds of shady activities out there, and I can sit on the pew on a Sunday and worship and praise God. And that's it. So that's what it leads to. It leads to a lot of nominal Christians. Second one is that it also leads to a tendency to cultural conservatism. How does that work? Well, the cultural conservative is somebody who is just content to let society and economic life remain as it is. There's nothing I can do to fix the tension. I can't do it. So, que sera, sera. Let me just participate in it. So, things like slavery, social stratification, rich and poor. Sometimes these types of Christians do absolutely nothing about these issues. It's just the way the world is. I can't solve it. And so, the only institutional change which Martin Luther focused on was the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church. But German culture, German society, yeah, que sera, sera. Right? So that's what it can lead to. So these are the 5 typologies. Wow, we have covered 4 of them already. So next week we have only 1 left. Wow. So the first one that we looked at was the Christ against culture typology, because there's no point of contact between the Christian and the culture at large. And so these people withdraw from the culture completely. We don't want anything to do with the culture. Christ against culture. The Christ of culture types, their Christianity and the culture are so harmonized together that there's hardly any point of difference between them. These are the cultural Christians, right? They live in the world, enjoy the world, sin don't really bother me. I just love life. It's great. And usually, as we saw, the Christ against culture people are the ones who are oppressed or at the bottom of the social economic status ladder. They don't have any political power. They don't have any money. They're usually the ones that are at the fringes of society. While the Christ of culture types are usually the ones who have the power. Therefore, they can relax and enjoy life. It's great. So it's almost like if you look in Jesus' day, the Essenes were the ones who separated from Jewish culture. While the Sadducees, they enjoyed the Jewish culture because they were rich and they had all the power. So those are the 2 extremes. And then last week we looked at the Catholic model, Thomas Aquinas, which is the Christ above culture type. Everything hierarchical. Culture is good because it's God ordained. We participate in it. Yes, there are problems with it, but for Thomas Aquinas, the solution to bad reasoning is good reasoning. Whereas for Martin Luther, the solution to bad reasoning is help God. See? So this is basically the Roman Catholic model. And then today we looked at the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, which is the Christ and culture in paradox. Just like the Roman Catholic model, there are points of contact. As you can see, you participate in the culture. You do. Right? You can't escape it. You're not against the Christ against culture, even though you acknowledge some of their things. But you can't escape the world, so therefore might as well just participate in it and be a part of it. And so if we look at it in a line, if we put it in like a line, like, American politics, they love to do that. The liberals and the Democrats on one side and the conservatives and whatever. You always make lines in America. I don't know why. Everything is lines and lines. But if you put it in a line, the extremes are the Christ against culture types and the Christ of culture types, right? And then the centrist, the median positions are these other three. The above, in paradox, and transforming, because they have some point of contact with the culture, right? But to me, the Roman Catholic model tends to align more this side, towards the Christ of culture, whereas the Martin Luther type has more affinities towards the Christ against culture type. So even though they're centered, they're in the center, one tends to center right and the other tends to center left. And here's the funniest thing. Well, it's not funny. The centrist ones are the ones who viciously criticize each other the most, even though they have more in common than the extremes. Isn't that the way life works? So, yeah. And so next week, we will look at the final typology, which is the Christ transforming culture. And incidentally, there is a reason why it is the final one. Because although Niebuhr pretends to be very objective in his book, Christ of Culture, usually you can tell by any professor that the last one is the one that he favors, right? So that was the one that Niebuhr will favor the most, Christ transforming culture. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. I hope that it was enlightening. I hope that it helped explain a little bit of where you are in your own particular Christian walk, and not just where you are, but why other Christian communities or individuals behave the way they do in the culture at large, and why there are different answers from different Christian communities to the enduring problem of how to interact with the culture at large. And so today we're able to see the Lutheran position. Again, it's incredibly complicated stuff, as the gentleman was talking about over here. Sometimes, the word paradox itself is extremely difficult. The word dualism, as Niebuhr acknowledges at the very beginning of his chapter on this, he is for want of a better word to describe this. So I hope this was very, very helpful. And at this point, I just want to open the floor up to any Q&A, any questions. I won't have all the answers because I live in the tension between things also, and sometimes I don't have the answer. Questions on Luther? They didn't even ask questions about the bobblehead doll. Is it okay for Christians to drink beer?
Yes.
That's a very Lutheran answer.
Yeah. I don't drink beer, I'm more wine.
Yeah. Is it okay to drink wine?
Yes.
Now you know that there's some Christ against culture types who would say no, right? But there's still Christians also. That's why we get the different kinds of answers, depending on which sort of a paradigm, which sort of typology you come from, you get a different Christian answer to these questions.
Everything in moderation.
Everything in moderation. That's another. Very Aristotelian right there. Uh-huh.
So is there one that's, I guess what I would say is salvation's from all the different groups, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So in the end, does it really matter which group you pick?
That's a very Lutheran thing. Also, right there. Yeah. Uh-huh.
No, I mean, individually, it may be important to me.
Right.
Who I pick.
Right.
But I'm saying collectively,
Uh-huh. Well.
you pick Christ and culture
Uh-huh.
together, and their salvation, just because I disagree with that, doesn't mean I'm right and they're wrong.
Right.
Only in my world does it make it right and wrong. If they're saved as well as I am, then it matters.
Absolutely. Doesn't matter. That's a very, very good question. I mean, what? Yeah. Because if we go a little bit deeper into Christian theology, yes, it does matter. It really does matter. In fact, there are lots of people who are supposed nominal Christians who are not going to make it to heaven. They sit in the church pew Sunday upon Sunday, but they're not going to make it. It's what Jesus talks about when he says in the Gospel of Matthew, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?" You know, there are people who are going to come to me on that day when they die and go to heaven and come to me and say, "Lord, but didn't I do this for you? Didn't I do miracles and whatever stuff?" And he'll say, "Away from me, I never knew you." So your doctrine of salvation matters big time. What saves, how you are saved, these are things that are very, very serious. You know, if your eternal destiny is grounded on your perception of how you were saved, well, it's not grounded on that. I'm sorry about that. Even that would be a wrong statement to make. But on the fact that you have made a born-again decision into a new life, a born-again life, that's it. Every other thing is non-salvific. It's a big sola scriptura, sola fide, sola grati. This is the Martin Luther view. Now, this is not saying that because you're a Roman Catholic, you're not saved. Martin Luther would never say that himself. He is a Roman Catholic. There are people in different typologies and different things which are saved, but there are quite a significant amount of Roman Catholics who are not saved. I grew up in Brazil, which is like a 90% Roman Catholic country, but they're all godless, heathen pagans. They're just nominally Catholic. Or when I was at the University of St. Andrews, and this is funny, my German roommate, he called himself a Christian, but he didn't believe there was a God. He didn't believe that there was such a thing as heaven and hell. This is the only life that exists. Oh, how are you a Christian? Oh, he's a cultural Christian because Germany is a Christian nation. So he calls himself a Christian, but he doesn't believe any other stuff.
So what about people who are spiritual, pray,
but not religious,
but don't go to church? Are they saved?
Some of them might be, but I'll say this. It's extremely difficult to find somebody who has a living faith, in my own experience, I'm talking from my own personal experience, who has a vibrant, living, born-again Christian faith who doesn't go to church. I've hardly ever found anybody like that. There might be. There really might be, but I've hardly ever found one.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. So, and this is just a sincere warning. This is the kind of angst that Martin Luther went through. And his solution to this is no solution really apart from the grace of God. And the Protestant Reformation, which we are all a part of, we are grace, saved by grace through faith. That's what we are. Because nothing that we do, you and me, is good enough. It ain't. If you're honest with yourself, it just ain't. And Martin Luther was very penetrating in his insight about the human condition, living as both a saint and a sinner in the world. Good insights. Very, very good insights. I trust that you all are having a wonderful time going through this Christ and Culture series. I trust that it is an eye-opener, because it was for me when I first started studying this book in seminary. It was incredible to finally figure out, oh, that's why my Quaker friend acts the way that he does. And my Baptist friend over here, his ultra-fundamentalist Baptist friend, acts the way that she does. And why I am the way I am also as a Christian. It began to make sense, finally. And I hope that's a very good eye-opener for us all. Because we all have to get along in this world, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Oh. You and then you.
My question was, what were his parents, Martin Luther's parents?
I think they were merchants, if I remember correctly. They were just like
I was just curious.
middle class, common middle class folks, merchants.
So anybody could go to
University?
Yeah, if they wanted to.
Well, yeah, in the medieval ages, this is what happened. Me and Fran actually talked about this on Thursday at the Potluck Bible Study. In the medieval times, you know, the firstborn son inherited all of the property. You didn't divide up the property because then it would just become, you know, weak. So the firstborn inherited everything. If you were second, third, fourth child, what did you do?
Became a priest.
Or a nun? You either joined the church, or you joined the army, or you hired yourself off to some knight as a vassal, you know, the peasant boy, the serfs. That's what you became. And so many non-firstborns did indeed join the church and became nuns and monks and people like that. Not necessarily because they wanted to. Martin Luther didn't want to, right? Until that lightning bolt came. He took that as a sign from God, you know. And, so maybe it really was a sign from God that my church is in dire need of reformation. I'm going to pick this crazy German dude to fix things up a little bit. So, good question. Very, very good. Thank you, Diana. Yeah. Fred.
Well, I was just thinking about all the things that my mother used to tell me, I guess when I was heading toward my teenage years. She said, we live in this world, but you certainly don't have to partake of everything the world has to offer.
Yeah.
You know, so I guess that's getting back to all the culture that's...
Yeah, you live in the world.
But you don't have to partake of everything that the world offers you.
Uh-huh.
And I was just wondering, when it comes to Christians, you know, sometimes I've always believed, you know, dancing was okay, but there are some Christians that
They don't?
no,
Exactly.
dancing is wrong, or
Yeah.
you know, different things like that. And I don't know how you talk to another Christian who tells you that what you think is okay, and they say, oh no, it's not. What do you...
But how do you do that? Well, you kindly perhaps educate them a little bit, you know, about the different families of the Christian
And
groups.
there are many things that are wrong.
Yeah.
To me, in the...
That I can't participate
that I
in.
can't participate, you know, drugs for one thing.
Yeah,
People probably think, oh, it's okay to smoke weed, or it's okay to do this, or it's okay to do
It
that.
reminds me of a hilarious conversation I had with my fellow theology students when I was in seminary, and some of them were discussing, should we experiment with marijuana? Just so that, you know, just so that we can understand what some people go through.
So I guess
I'm like, what are you talking about? I did that when I was a teenager. Don't.
so that's the dueling forces, I guess,
Yeah,
that we go through. We have to distinguish, maybe pray about it.
Right.
You know,
These are tough questions.
is this
Right.
something I should partake in, you know?
Yeah.
yea or nay? And
What are the things that I can participate in the culture? For me, I'm a great lover of the arts, movies, music, love that kind of stuff, you know? And I know that there's certain songs. I'm a great big fan of AC/DC. I love AC/DC. Back in Black was one of my favorite albums growing up as a teenager. Hell's Bells! But you know what? Now the song Hell's Bells comes up on the radio, and I have to change the channel. Because I can't participate because the lyrics.
Listen to the words.
The lyrics about Hell's Bells is about selling your soul to the devil for rock and roll. Yeah. I'm like, as much as I love this tune, I can't listen to it anymore.
Some of the words are worse than that, though.
Right. Yeah. Which, by the way, it's really, really funny, but one of my culture professors at Fuller Theological Seminary was a roadie for AC/DC before he became a Christian. I'm like, wow, how did that happen? But that's what he did. And so one day, in the culture class I was taking with him, when he told us that, after the class I had to go up to him and ask him, were you at 1985, were you at the Rock in Rio? And he goes, yes. And I go, I was in the crowd having a blast. There were 500,000 people there, and the waft of marijuana in the air was everywhere. You didn't even have to smoke it to get high. Yeah. I had some very rebellious teenage years. I think some of us do go through rebellious phases. Some do later in life. Mine were very early on in life because my dad died and I had to go out and experiment with the world. And so that's, I experimented with a lot of drugs, sex, and rock and roll in my teenage years. And I have to say that, that's what I was. And God saved me out of that mess that I made out of my life. That by the age of 17, I was so drug addicted. I was depressed out of my mind and suicidal. I couldn't see any reason to live in this crazy world anymore. Fortunately, I was just too much of a coward to kill myself. Because I broke the glass on my window and took the glass and put a little nick. I was just too cowardly to do that. But that's where I was. I was at the bottomless pit of despair, at the worst place that any human being can be at, when God came and grabbed me by the neck and pulled me out of there. So, am I like Luther and I say, I'm not saved by any works. I didn't do anything to deserve this. God is the one who... It wasn't me working and trying to do good stuff. I was doing seriously evil stuff, bad stuff in the world. And God came and pulled me out of that. So I can totally relate to Martin Luther and the nitty-gritty reality of the world that we live in as he explains it. Totally get it. And that's why I'm a salvation by grace through faith alone. Sola fide, sola gratia. I'm a Protestant. I protest. It's part of our heritage as Protestants. We protest corruption, institutionalized corruption. Generally speaking, Luther did that only for the church, but we should do that for society, for politics, for our culture at large also, if we are true and genuine Protestants, right? When we see injustice and oppression and people suffering and struggling. And let me tell you one thing, it ain't easy. Just being a foster parent has been hell. You probably all know that. It's incredibly... But like Luther, I can't escape it. I'm in this living, sorry for the language, but shithole. Right? Where it's both grace and sin in the same bucket. And I got to deal with this. And I hope that helps you to get a better picture of what the Protestant Reformation was all about. Thank you all. God bless you. Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate that.